The observatory floated in the endless dark, a lonely outpost orbiting a gas giant in a solar system long forgotten by most of humanity. The station's metal skin creaked under the slow, eternal pressure of space, and the vast, empty blackness beyond the viewing ports seemed to press against the walls, as if trying to seep in. Dr. Amelia Corwin leaned over her console, the cold blue glow of the screen casting shadows across her tired face. She hadn't slept in days, and the silence of the observatory was suffocating. Somewhere far off, she could hear the faint hum of the life support system, a rhythmic pulse that felt like the heartbeat of something vast and unseen. She glanced up, her eyes flickering to the red dwarf star that had been their subject for the last 6 months, hanging in the void like a single bloodshot eye. It pulsed dimly, almost weakly, as if struggling to keep itself alive. The star was an anomaly, a curiosity that had brought Amelia and her team to this desolate part of the galaxy. Unlike any other red dwarf, this one emitted bursts of radio signals at irregular intervals. Initially dismissed as background radiation, the signals had piqued the interest of the scientific community when someone noticed patterns hidden within the static, patterns that didn't fit any known cosmic phenomena. The observatory had been tasked with decoding those signals, and over the past months they had discovered a strange rhythm to them, a kind of cosmic Morse code. Amelia had hoped it was an indication of a natural process, something to be studied and documented. But as the signals became clearer, it was obvious that they were more than that. They carried information, data that wasn't meant to be understood by anything natural. Amelia's hands trembled slightly as she clicked through the latest analysis. She had been going over the same fragment of signal for hours, and it was beginning to unnerve her. It wasn't just the endless, droning static. It was the image she had uncovered, hidden deep within the radio waves, like a ghost buried under layers of noise. A skeletal shape, humanoid in form, with elongated limbs and a skull that seemed to twist into itself, like it was caught in the middle of some eternal scream. The image was incomplete, broken by interference, but it was enough to send a chill down her spine. The door slid open behind her, and Dr. Simon Hart stepped into the lab, his face pale and drawn. He had been keeping to himself lately, locked away in the genetics lab, running tests on data they had extracted from the signals. He had barely spoken to anyone in days. "Anything new?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. He looked around the room as if expecting something to jump out from the shadows. Amelia shook her head. "Same as before. The signal keeps repeating. But I found something." She hesitated, then brought up the image on the main screen. The skeletal figure appeared, its hollow eyes staring blankly, and Simon visibly recoiled. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. "I don't know," Amelia replied, "but it's embedded in the signal. It's like a transmission or a message. Whoever, or whatever, sent this, they wanted us to see it." Simon stared at the image, his hands clenching at his sides. "It doesn't make sense. How can a radio signal carry an image like that?" "I don't think it's just a radio signal," Amelia said quietly. "I think it's a form of communication, something we haven't seen before." She didn't tell him about the other things she had noticed. The faint whispers she thought she heard sometimes when she was alone in the lab, or the way the lights would flicker when she was working late at night. She didn't tell him about the dream she had the night before, where she was floating in the dark, surrounded by endless rows of skeletal figures, their bony hands reaching out for her, pulling her down into the abyss. Simon took a step closer, his eyes fixed on the screen. "Can you enhance it? Maybe clear up the interference?" Amelia hesitated, but nodded. She tapped a few keys, and the image sharpened, the skeletal figure becoming clearer, more defined. She could see the contours of the skull now, the way the jaw hung slightly open, as if it was silently screaming. But there was something else, too, something in the background, barely visible through the static. Another shape, larger, looming behind the skeletal figure. Simon squinted at the screen, then let out a low gasp. "There's more of them," he said. "Look." Amelia's blood ran cold. He was right. Dozens of shapes, all faint and indistinct, but unmistakably there, hidden within the static like shadows. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, and she had to look away, her eyes stinging with fear. "What does it mean?" she whispered. Simon didn't answer. He was still staring at the screen, his face pale, his eyes wide with a kind of manic intensity. "It's a message," he said finally, his voice barely audible. "They're trying to tell us something." Amelia wanted to argue, to say that it was impossible, that there was no way this could be real. But deep down, she knew he was right. Whatever this was, it wasn't natural. It was deliberate, a signal sent across the vast, empty void of space, carrying a message that had been waiting for someone, anyone, to hear it. She turned back to the console, her hands shaking as she brought up the latest batch of data. As she scanned the lines of code, a new image began to emerge, pieced together from fragments hidden within the signal. She could see it slowly forming on the screen, taking shape pixel by pixel, and as it did, her heart began to race, a cold, hollow feeling spreading through her chest. The image was of an embryo, suspended in a translucent sac, floating in the dark. It was small, barely formed, but she could see the beginnings of limbs, the curve of a spine, and it was unmistakably human. Amelia's mind reeled. She had expected something alien, something completely foreign, but this was human, or at least it looked human. She glanced at Simon and saw that he was staring at the screen, his face twisted in a grimace of disbelief. "What are we looking at?" he muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. Amelia didn't know what to say. She could feel the dark, cold void outside pressing against the walls, as if the star itself was watching them, waiting for them to understand. And as she stared at the image on the screen, she felt a sudden, terrifying certainty that whatever this was, it wasn't meant for them. It was a warning or a call or something far worse. The radio signal continued to pulse, a slow, steady rhythm that echoed through the empty halls of the observatory, and for a moment, Amelia thought she could hear a voice, buried deep within the static, whispering something just out of reach. She strained to hear it, her breath caught in her throat, but it was gone, leaving only the faint, hollow echo of the signal and the cold, unblinking eye of the red dwarf staring down at them from the darkness. She shuddered and turned away from the screen, unable to shake the feeling that something terrible was about to happen. The observatory's lab was bathed in the dim, artificial light that never seemed to reach the corners. Every object cast a long, distorted shadow, giving the room an eerie, otherworldly feel. Dr. Simon Hart sat hunched over his terminal, his eyes bloodshot and twitching from lack of sleep. He hadn't left the lab in days, and it showed. His once crisp lab coat was now wrinkled and stained, and the dark circles under his eyes made him look like a ghost of his former self. He typed furiously, his fingers moving almost mechanically across the keys. Each new line of data brought a fresh wave of anxiety, but he couldn't stop. He was close to something important, and the need to understand it had become an obsession. The others had started avoiding him, whispering behind his back, but he didn't care. They didn't understand. They couldn't see what he saw. The genetic analysis of the signal data had been a nightmare to decode. It wasn't just a matter of translating information. It was as if the data was fighting back, trying to twist and warp itself into something unrecognizable. But after countless sleepless nights, he had managed to extract a sequence, a genetic code hidden within the noise. And that was when he realized how wrong everything was. The DNA patterns he uncovered were familiar. Painfully so. They were almost identical to human DNA, but not quite. There were subtle, terrifying differences. The more he analyzed, the clearer it became that these differences weren't mutations or errors. They were deliberate, precise modifications. It was as if someone or something had taken the blueprint of humanity and rearranged it, creating something that looked human but wasn't. Simon stared at the screen, his mind struggling to comprehend what he was seeing. It was impossible, yet there it was. An undeniable link between the signal from the Red Dwarf and the very essence of human life. He had run the data through every database they had, and each time it returned the same result. The genetic sequence embedded in the signal was a near-perfect match for the human genome, with just enough variation to suggest something older, something that predated humanity as they knew it. He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples. The room seemed to shrink around him, the walls pressing closer, and the hum of the machines grew louder, more insistent. He glanced at the closed door, half expecting to see one of the skeletal figures from the signal standing there, watching him. He shuddered and looked away. The door hissed open and Dr. Amelia Corwin stepped inside, her face pale and drawn. She hadn't seen Simon in over a day, and she was beginning to worry. When she saw him hunched over his terminal, she felt a pang of relief mixed with dread. She could see the state he was in, and it frightened her. "Simon," she said, her voice barely masking her concern, "you need to take a break. You look exhausted." "I'm fine," he muttered, not looking up. "I'm close. I just need a little more time." Amelia hesitated, then moved closer, peering over his shoulder at the screen. Her eyes widened as she saw the genetic sequence displayed there, a series of familiar and yet strangely alien patterns. "What is this?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's them," Simon said, his voice hoarse. "The ones who sent the signal. I think they're like us. Or maybe we're like them." He finally turned to look at her, and she saw the fear in his eyes, a deep, gnawing terror that sent chills down her spine. "The DNA, it matches. Almost exactly." Amelia felt her heart skip a beat. "That's impossible. How could—" "I don't know," Simon interrupted, his voice rising. "But it's there. It's been staring us in the face this whole time. Whatever sent that signal, it's connected to us. We're not the first. We're a copy, an imitation." Amelia's mind raced as she tried to process what he was saying. The implications were horrifying. If what Simon was suggesting was true, then humanity wasn't alone in the universe, not by a long shot. But it also meant that humanity wasn't unique. They were a product of something else, something ancient and unknowable, and that thought made her stomach turn. Simon turned back to the screen, his eyes wild. "I've been analyzing the variations in the sequence. They're not random. They're engineered, like someone was trying to create something specific. I think they were experimenting. and we're just one of their iterations." "What are you saying?" Amelia asked, her voice trembling. "I'm saying we're a failed experiment," Simon said, his voice barely audible. "Whatever they were trying to make, we're not it. We're just the leftovers. They abandoned us, left us to rot on Earth, and now they're calling us back." Amelia felt a cold chill spread through her, and she took a step back, as if she could distance herself from the terrible truth Simon was uncovering. "How do you know that?" Simon hesitated, then reached for a stack of printouts, his hands shaking. "I've been decoding more of the signal. It's not just data, it's a message. I think it's a command. It's repeating, over and over, like a heartbeat. They're calling something, or someone, back to them." Amelia felt a wave of nausea wash over her. But why? Why would they do that? Simon's eyes were wide, haunted. "I don't know. Maybe they're looking for the ones they lost. Maybe they're trying to find out if their experiment worked after all. Or maybe..." He trailed off, his voice dropping to a whisper. "Maybe they're coming back to finish what they started." Amelia's breath hitched. She glanced around the room, as if expecting to see something lurking in the shadows. For the first time, she felt truly afraid, not just of the unknown, but of the possibility that everything she thought she knew about humanity was a lie. She turned to Simon, her hands clenched into fists. "We need to tell the others. We need to..." "No!" Simon snapped, his voice harsh. "Not yet. We're not ready. We need more information. If we go public with this now, they'll shut us down. They'll bury this, just like they've buried everything else." Amelia was about to argue when the lights flickered, plunging the room into momentary darkness. She felt her heart stop, and when the lights came back on, she could have sworn she saw a shadow move at the edge of her vision, something thin and skeletal slipping into the darkness. She blinked, but it was gone. Simon didn't seem to notice. He was still staring at his screen, his eyes glazed over, as if he was seeing something far away. "I need to keep going," he muttered. "I need to understand." Amelia felt a deep, overwhelming sense of dread. She wanted to reach out to him, to pull him away from the screen and tell him to stop. But she couldn't move. It was as if something was holding her in place, paralyzing her with fear. She could still hear the faint hum of the machines, but now it sounded different, darker, more insistent, like a low, rhythmic chant. "Simon," she said finally, her voice trembling. "We're not alone here, are we?" Simon looked up at her, and for a moment she thought she saw something shift behind his eyes, something dark and ancient, something that didn't belong. "No," he said quietly. "We're not. We never were." Amelia felt a chill run down her spine, and she knew deep down that whatever was out there, watching them, had been waiting for this moment for a long time. The signals, the genetic code, the images, they were all pieces of a puzzle that was only just beginning to take shape. And as she looked at Simon, she realized with a sinking dread that he had already started to see the picture. He turned back to his terminal, his fingers flying over the keys, and the room was filled with the sound of static, a harsh, grating noise that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Amelia closed her eyes, but she couldn't block it out. It was inside her head, twisting and turning, and in that moment she understood. The signal wasn't just a message. It was a call to something far older than humanity, something that had been waiting in the dark, biding its time. And now it was waking up. The observatory felt like a tomb. The corridors stretched out into endless darkness, illuminated only by the flickering emergency lights that cast harsh, stuttering shadows across the metal walls. The hum of the life support system had grown louder, more erratic, like a machine struggling to stay alive. It was as if the station itself could sense something was wrong, something that no one dared to speak about. Dr. Amelia Corwin wandered the dim halls, clutching a worn data pad in her hands, her eyes wide and bloodshot. She had tried to sleep, but every time she closed her eyes, she was haunted by visions of skeletal figures drifting in the dark, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their mouths twisted into silent screams. The dreams felt like memories, as if she was seeing something she had forgotten, something that had been buried deep within her mind. She was exhausted, but the fear wouldn't let her rest. She hadn't seen Dr. Simon Hart in over a day. After their last conversation, he had locked himself in the genetics lab, muttering something about finishing the analysis. She had banged on the door, pleaded with him to come out, but there had been no response. Now the lab was sealed, the windows darkened, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. Amelia glanced down at the datapad, scrolling through Simon's notes. They were a chaotic mess of numbers, diagrams, and half-formed sentences, but one thing was clear. He was obsessed. He had been running simulations, cross-referencing genetic patterns from the signal data with known human DNA, and his findings were disturbing. The more she read, the more her stomach churned. It was as if he was trying to prove something, trying to find a connection that shouldn't exist. She found herself at the entrance to the genetics lab, the heavy door looming before her like the mouth of a cave. She hesitated, her hand hovering over the control panel. She wanted to turn back, to run, but she couldn't. She needed to know what Simon had found. She needed to understand why everything felt like it was falling apart. The door hissed open, and a wave of cold, sterile air washed over her. The lab was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the monitors, casting an eerie pale green light across the room. The smell hit her next, a sharp metallic tang like blood and ozone. She stepped inside, her heart pounding in her chest, and her eyes fell on the figure slumped over the console at the far end of the room. "Simon?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. He didn't move. She took a step closer, and her breath caught in her throat. His back was to her, his shoulders hunched, his head hanging low. There was something off about the way he was sitting, as if his body was limp, lifeless. For a moment she was sure he was dead, but then he twitched, a sudden, jerking movement that made her jump. "Simon," she said again, louder this time. Slowly he turned to face her, and she felt her blood run cold. His eyes were wide, unblinking, and there were dark purple circles under them, as if he hadn't slept in days. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and his lips were cracked and dry. But it was his expression that terrified her the most, an expression of pure, unfiltered horror, as if he had seen something that had shattered his mind. "They're here," he whispered, his voice raspy and strained. "They're here, Amelia. They've always been here." "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice trembling. "Who's here?" Simon's mouth twitched and he let out a low, hollow laugh. "You don't get it, do you? We're not alone. We've never been alone. They've been watching us, waiting, and now they're waking up." He reached for the console, his hand shaking, and brought up a new set of data on the screen. Amelia's eyes scanned the lines of code, trying to make sense of it, but it was like looking at a nightmare made of numbers. There were genetic sequences, but they were wrong, twisted into shapes that shouldn't exist, patterns that defied logic. And there was something else, images, distorted and flickering, showing things that shouldn't be possible. She saw a planet shrouded in a thick red mist, with twisted spires rising from the surface like jagged teeth. She saw creatures, not quite human, crawling across the barren landscape, their limbs too long, their skin too pale, their faces devoid of features. And she saw the red dwarf star, pulsing in the sky like a dying heartbeat, casting its sickly light across everything. "What is this?" she whispered, her hands shaking. "It's their world," Simon said, his eyes fixed on the screen. "It's where they came from. They tried to create life, but it was a failure. Everything, twisted, corrupted. They abandoned it, left it to die, and they started over. But they never really stopped watching. They wanted to see if we would be different." Amelia felt a cold sweat break out across her skin. "What do you mean, they started over?" Simon turned to her and she saw tears in his eyes. "We're their experiment, Amelia. Humanity. We're just another attempt, another iteration. They seeded life on Earth, hoping it would turn out better this time. But it didn't. We're just as flawed as the ones that came before us." "No," Amelia said, shaking her head. "That's not possible. You're wrong." "Am I?" Simon asked, his voice barely more than a whisper. "Then why do the signals keep repeating? Why do they keep sending the same message over and over? They're calling to us, Amelia, calling us home." She took a step back, her mind reeling. She wanted to deny it, to say that he was crazy, but deep down she knew he was telling the truth. The signals, the genetic data, the images, they all pointed to the same horrifying conclusion. Humanity wasn't special. They weren't unique. They were a product, an experiment created by something far older and far more powerful than they could comprehend. Simon reached out and grabbed her arm, his grip surprisingly strong. "We need to listen," he said, his eyes wild. "We need to understand what they want. If we don't..." The lights flickered and the room was plunged into darkness. Amelia froze, her heart pounding in her ears, and for a moment the only sound was the faint, rhythmic pulse of the red dwarf signal, echoing through the silence like a heartbeat. When the lights came back on, Simon was standing right in front of her, his face inches from hers, and she could see the desperation in his eyes. "They're waking up," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "And they're coming for us." Amelia jerked away from him, stumbling backward, her breath coming in short, panicked gasps. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the air growing thick and suffocating. She wanted to scream, to run, but she couldn't move. It was as if something was holding her in place, a dark, invisible force pressing down on her, suffocating her. The door to the lab slid open and she saw Dr. Miriam Price, one of the other researchers, standing in the doorway. Her face was blank, her eyes glassy, as if she was in a trance. She walked into the room without saying a word, her movements stiff and mechanical, and Amelia felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. "Miriam," she said, her voice barely audible, "what are you doing here?" Miriam didn't answer. She walked to the console, her eyes fixed on the screen, and began typing, her fingers moving with unnatural precision. The monitors flickered and a new image appeared. A figure draped in shadows, standing beneath the red dwarf, its face obscured, but its eyes glowing with a dull, sickly light. Amelia felt her knees buckle, and she fell to the floor, her vision blurring. She could hear the faint hum of the machines, the rhythmic pulse of the signal, and somewhere, faint and distant, a voice whispering, calling her name. She tried to block it out, but it grew louder, more insistent, until it was all she could hear. Simon knelt beside her, his face twisted with a mix of fear and awe. "Do you hear it?" he whispered. "They're calling us. They're calling us home." Amelia closed her eyes, but the images were still there, burned into her mind. She saw the twisted spires, the pale, crawling figures, and the red dwarf, pulsing like a heartbeat. She felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of despair, a realization that no matter what they did, no matter how hard they tried to understand, it was already too late. The signal was getting stronger, the stars were waking up, and they were coming. The observatory was dying. The once faint hum of the life support system had turned into a tortured, guttural noise, as if the machines were choking on their last breaths. Lights flickered sporadically, plunging the corridors into pitch-black darkness for agonizingly long stretches before stuttering back to life. The air was stale, thick, and heavy, making it feel like the walls themselves were suffocating under some unseen pressure. Dr. Amelia Corwin stumbled through the dim hallways, her head throbbing, her vision swimming. She had been running for what felt like hours, but she didn't know where she was going anymore. She had seen things she couldn't explain, things that defied reality. Images of skeletal figures crawling out of the darkness, their hollow eyes fixed on her, their bony hands outstretched, whispering in a language she couldn't understand. They were everywhere now, drifting in and out of the shadows, just on the edge of her vision. And Simon was gone. She had left him in the lab, his eyes wide and unseeing, his hands still moving across the console even after the lights had failed completely. The last words he had whispered echoed in her mind, over and over, like a mantra. "They're waking up, and they're coming for us." Amelia reached the control room, her legs trembling beneath her. The door slid open with a strained hiss, and she stepped inside, blinking against the harsh light of the monitors. The room was empty, except for the console at the center, which was still active, its screens filled with lines of indecipherable code and distorted images. She approached it slowly, her heart pounding, and saw that the transmission from the Red Dwarf was still running, pulsing steadily, relentlessly. She hesitated, her hands hovering over the controls. Part of her wanted to shut it down, to sever the connection, but she knew it was pointless. Whatever was happening, it had already begun, and there was no stopping it now. She could feel it, deep in her bones, a low, rhythmic thrum like the beating of a heart, resonating through the entire station. She took a deep breath and activated the final analysis, her fingers trembling as she keyed in the command. The screen flickered, then began to display a new set of data. This time there were no cryptic codes, no hidden patterns. The message was clear, unmistakable, and it filled the screen with a single repeating phrase. "Come home." Amelia's vision blurred, and she blinked furiously, trying to focus. The words seemed to pulse in time with the signal, drawing her in, compelling her to read them over and over. She could hear the whispers growing louder, filling the room, and she realized with a sickening jolt that they were speaking in perfect unison with the words on the screen, as if the signal itself was alive, breathing, and calling out to her. She slammed her hand down on the console, desperate to shut it off, but the screen only flickered. the message growing larger, bolder, until it filled her entire field of vision. "Come home, come home, come home." "No," she whispered, her voice cracking. "No, this isn't real. It can't be." But deep down, she knew it was. She had known it since the moment they had first intercepted the signal, since she had seen the skeletal figures, the embryo floating in the dark, the twisted genetic sequences that shouldn't exist. It had all been leading to this, a revelation she couldn't deny any longer. She stepped back, her hands shaking, and the screen changed, the words dissolving into a new image, a planet shrouded in a dark crimson haze with jagged mountains rising from the surface like broken teeth. It was the same world she had seen before, the world Simon had shown her, but this time it was clearer, more vivid, as if she was looking through a window into a place she was never meant to see. The image shifted and she saw them. The creatures, hundreds of them, crawling across the barren landscape, their bodies contorted, their limbs twisted into impossible angles. They were moving towards something vast and shadowy that loomed on the horizon, barely visible through the haze. It was a structure, a massive towering spire, pulsing with a dim red light, the same color as the dying star that hung above it. The screen flickered again, and suddenly she was there, standing on the surface of that alien world, the red mist swirling around her feet, the air thick with the smell of rust and decay. She could feel the ground vibrating beneath her, could hear the distant, thunderous roar of something massive, something ancient, stirring beneath the surface. She looked up, and the sky was dark, filled with swirling, writhing shapes, like clouds made of shadows, shifting and coiling around each other. And then she heard it. The voice. It was everywhere, echoing across the barren plains, rising from the ground, falling from the sky, and it spoke with a low, guttural tone, a language she couldn't understand but somehow knew, as if it had been buried deep within her mind all her life, waiting to be remembered. "You are ours." Amelia gasped, the words striking her like a physical blow. She fell to her knees, clutching her head, trying to block out the voice, but it was inside her, twisting and writhing, filling her mind with images of dark, empty halls, of silent, skeletal figures drifting through space, of the red dwarf star watching her, unblinking, waiting. "You have always been ours," she screamed, a raw, desperate sound that echoed through the control room, but there was no one to hear it. The signal grew louder, more insistent, and she could feel something pulling at her, dragging her deeper, pulling her into the dark. She saw Earth, distant and small, a fragile blue dot hanging in the void, and she knew with a sickening clarity that it was just another part of the experiment, another attempt to create something that could never be. The image on the screen shifted again, showing a close-up of the red dwarf, its surface roiling and bubbling like a cauldron, and she realized that it wasn't a star at all. It was a prison, a cage built to contain something vast, something terrible, something that was never meant to be released. But the cage was failing, the walls cracking, the ancient seals weakening, and whatever was inside was waking up, stretching its limbs, reaching out across the void. Amelia felt tears streaming down her cheeks, but she couldn't stop staring at the screen. The message changed again, and this time there was no mistaking the meaning. "We are your creators. We are your end." She could feel the cold tendrils of fear wrapping around her heart, squeezing tighter and tighter until she could barely breathe. She wanted to run, to hide, but there was nowhere to go. The signal was everywhere, in the walls, in the air, in her mind, and it was drawing her closer, pulling her towards the inevitable, final truth. The red light on the screen pulsed, and she felt herself falling, tumbling through the dark, down, 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 until she was back in the lab, standing before the console, her hands gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles were white. The signal was still there, pulsing steadily, and she knew with a cold, sinking certainty that it would never stop, not until it had finished what it had started. She looked up and saw her reflection in the dark glass of the monitor. But it wasn't her, it was something else, something with her face but not her eyes. The eyes were black, empty, endless, and they stared back at her with a look of cold, detached curiosity, as if she was just another specimen, another piece of data to be analyzed and discarded. The whispers grew louder, and she could feel herself slipping, losing her grip on reality, on herself. She could hear the voice clearer now, speaking to her, telling her everything she had been too afraid to understand. You were never meant to exist. You are a mistake, and now you will be corrected. The lights in the control room flickered, and the monitors went dark, plunging the room into silence. Amelia stood there, alone in the dark, the echo of the Red Dwarf's heartbeat still pounding in her ears, and she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her, a cold, numb acceptance. There was no escape. There never had been. This was always how it was going to end. The screen lit up one final time, and she saw the message, clear and simple, as if it had been written just for her. Come home. And she understood. She was never meant to be here. None of them were. They were just echoes, shadows of something long forgotten, drifting in the dark, waiting to be called back. She felt the pull, a gentle, insistent tug, and she closed her eyes, letting it carry her away, back to the place she had never known but had always been a part of. As the last light in the observatory flickered and died, the signal pulsed one final time, sending its message across the empty, silent void, out into the cold, dark expanse of space. And somewhere, far away, something ancient and vast stirred, its eyes opening for the first time in eons, and it smiled, knowing that its children were finally coming home. The darkness closed in around her, and she was gone, lost in the endless, empty black, where there was no light, no sound, and no hope. Only the signal, pulsing steadily, a heartbeat that would echo forever, calling out to the stars, waiting for a response that would never come.